discussing it amongst ourselves, we thought that, there are really four things that stand out in her work. One element is her philosophical style, so we'll discuss that for a little bit. What makes her so particular as a philosopher, and any one of you who ever has opened up one of her books or articles will find this in a fresh, engaging style, but also with a particular slant, which is informed to a large part by Wittgenstein's philosophy. So we'll talk a bit about that. Then her maiden target in life was moral subjectivism. And we'll give you a definition of that and talk about her response to it and how successful or unsuccessful that response was. Moral subjectivism, very roughly, we'll get to a more precise definition later, is the idea that there is no objective truth in morality. Moral judgments are just constituted by some judgments of your own about the desirableness or the appropriateness of some form of action or inaction, and you have certain attitudes that you express when you make a moral judgment. It's like lying is wrong is basically saying, I disapprove of lying, or as some people have said, boo for lying, is the moral subjectivist view. That was her target. Another main question that she addressed was why be moral? And we'll look at that as well. And finally, she became famous through her work on a series of moral dilemmas, as she called them. And she's the godmother, we should say, of the Trolley Problem that many of you may have heard of. If you haven't, we'll rehearse not every version of the Trolley Problem, but her first initial version, which is very interesting. But to begin, I'll just mention a few things about her life, besides the things she worked on. So she was born in 1920 into a rather aristocratic family, which she said favored hunting and shooting and fishing. And she didn't receive any formal education out of the home, I believe. You might correct me on this, until she went to university. She had a governess. And she said that governesses were not much use, especially not with math, but they were kind of pleasant to talk to. But one did push her, and she said made her try to go to university, and she tried to get out of this, she said, rather socially snobby, but not intellectually snobby background to the well-known egalitarian haven of Oxford, where she studied at Somerville College, then worked during the war as an economist in the civil service, and shared a room with Iris Murdoch, I believe, shared a flat where they became friends. And it may be interesting to note that in this time was, of course, the time of the Blitz and V1 and V2 rockets raining down on London. And there's an interesting connection between the trolley problem, which we'll get to at the end, and something the British government did at the time, which they were, so to speak, in the firing line of, which is redirect the V1 and V2 rockets onto less populated areas of London. We'll come to that parallel later. After the war, she returned to Somerville College, and partly under the influence of Anscombe, really started working on moral philosophy, and wrote wonderful collections of articles, some of which I have here if you want to look at them afterwards, working on these questions. Then had a period working in the United States at various universities like UCLA, where she worked for quite a while, and returned to Somerville. So that's an outline of her life and some of the problems she worked on. But Sarah has more personal recollections as well, right?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I was taught by Philippa in the 1960s. I was at Somerville, and she was one of the moral philosophy tutors there. I have to say, I remember vividly her as a tutor giving us, or me, tutorials. I don't remember a single lecture that she gave, and whether it's just for some reason she was not lecturing during that time, or that's my deficiency. Maybe she was and I didn't go, which I don't think is very likely, or else I've just forgotten. But anyway, she was a very kind person, extremely generous person. Everybody who knew her echoes that. She had lovely manners, but not at all intimidating, or she was a very modest person. And although she was so nice, one of the most important things about her was that she had very, very high standards, intellectual standards. And I think this, of course, went with the modesty, because I think she gave she sort of gave out a very strong sense of, without labouring it, how hard it is to do philosophy. And, and she somehow managed to convey that so as to make herself and oneself very serious, but without making it intimidating or making it seem some kind of elite enclave, which one had no hope of sharing. She had a wonderful sense of humour. She was always laughing, not a loud laugher, as I remember, but sort of laughing and chuckling over some weird implication of a philosophical view, an academic philosophical view. She was rather elegant in a quiet and, again, not particularly intimidating way. But, I have to say that to be more elegant than the average don at Somerville, especially in those, was not a hard thing to achieve. She was not a militant feminist. I mean, her life just, she, as it were, wasn't in the right generation. And whether she would have been born 20 years later or whatever, I just couldn't possibly begin to guess. But on that sort of general topic, I have to say that she was a wonderful example for younger women, whether in philosophy or in some other academic career. And looking back, I didn't think of it like this way at the time, but looking back, I realised that she, in fact, was a wonderful example of a teacher, whether a male teacher or female teacher. I mean, she just had the right combination of high standards, very friendly, accessible personality, and what more do you want, really, and very conscientious. She would always, there was never any messing around with punctuality or anything like that. As far as being a wonderful example for younger women in academic life, I have to say that in this respect, she was a sort of foil or a contrast with Elizabeth Anscombe, who was also my tutor, not, I think, simultaneously, and who was at Somerville at that time before she went to a chair in Cambridge. Because Elizabeth Anscombe was definitely, as I'm sure everybody knows, she was a terrific philosopher, but she was a very intimidating person. Whether she had to be for various reasons, I expect it was a mixture of just basic personality and, as it were, having to be. And she was also, in some ways, somewhat eccentric. Not a wild eccentric, but, not a kind of middle-of-the-road person. And so not very many of us would have dared that, or even necessarily wished, to be like Elizabeth Anscombe. We were, so much in awe of her. But Philippa, with her, it was different. One could, as it were, imagine following in the tracks of someone like Philippa Foot. So those are my personal reminiscences.
Good. Well, it's funny you mentioned Anscombe. When I did an interview with Philippa Foot for the book that Christina mentioned, and I asked her who was her biggest influence, and she said Elizabeth Anscombe, but it wasn't fun in the beginning. And she described her going to her seminars where Anscombe would propound a view and Philippa would object, and she would be, she said, I was like one of those cartoon characters who would be hammered down into the ground by a great boulder or a man with a big mallet, but who appeared in the next episode unscathed, back next week, objecting again. And I had one or two other things about her style, right? So this is a bit more than just about personality, though there is one funny thing she says at the beginning, which is not just funny, but I think also very accurate of her view. She says, I'm not clever at all. I'm a dreadfully slow thinker, but I have a good nose for what's important. And even though the best philosophers combine cleverness and depth, I prefer a good nose over cleverness any day. And now it's nicely expressed here and with humility, but or some humility anyway. But there is a critique here of the way a lot of academic philosophy might read, especially to someone untrained in the discipline, which is you open a book on ethics and it'll be full of isms and moves and counter moves in a very elaborate, what looks like an extremely elaborate chess game. By contrast, if one reads Foot's work, there's very little jargon. There's always honing in directly on the core of the problem. And her first question is always, what's the worry? What is the problem exactly? And some of her papers spend a lot of time just trying to figure out what precisely the worry is that gets us going in our moral questioning. And that's the second point, which her style of doing philosophy, I think, is influenced by Wittgenstein, who was, of course, who influenced Anscombe. So she said to me that she was once at a seminar where a speaker realized that there was some absurd implication of his view, and so he withdrew back from the ledge. He was about to express it, and then realized, what I'm going to say now is really stupid. I'm not going to say this thing. And Wittgenstein got very angry and said, say it, say what you want to say, and then we can do some philosophy. Because then we have in our hands the problem, which is at the heart of your view. So this is what she said she learned from that. Whenever I find myself tempted to pass over an odd thought, I press myself to do the opposite. So I'd say, stick with the odd thought, it's gold. The philosophical interest is where the trouble is. And I think that's a very, again, it's something that marks her work, but is a very useful general attitude in philosophy, to make sure that we've started where we think there's a problem. Was that your experience as well when you were taught by her?
I think I was too unsophisticated to be able to make observations like that. I mean, I was just learning philosophy for the first time, really, yeah. And of course, again, as it were, again, it just shows that I probably wasn't living properly in the real world, but I was not aware that she was always going to be such an important person, yeah. But I certainly agree. I mean, having read her work a number of times over the years, I certainly agree with everything that you have just said. I mean, her whole method and approach to all the problems that she discussed was she brought to it not just an ordinary language sensibility, which of course was the sort of standard, a necessary qualification in Oxford at that time. But I think a very clear perception of ways in which so-called ordinary people, which of course is almost all of us, feel and think, particularly about morality and related questions about things, things that are important from a practical point of view. So she took this very seriously. The result was that what Alex just quoted about her not being impressed by cleverness, I would say she was completely unmoved by the sort of theoretical beauty of some moral theory. I mean, obviously consequentialism, or some simple form of consequentialism, comes to mind. It brings everything under one principle. It's simplifying, it unifies. It's supposed to unify all our moral intuitions and so on. Of course, many people don't think it works. So it has got a sort of simplicity and beauty about it of a theoretical kind. And I think more than almost anybody else that I've encountered, directly or indirectly, she wasn't, it's not as if she had a sort of philistinic kind of, I don't care for beauty, even theoretical beauty. There was nothing crude about it, but she just wasn't moved by that. So if, for example, there was some kind of clash, as obviously there is, between some consequentialist implication and some datum of so-called ordinary morals, common sense, Philippa wouldn't immediately jump to the aid or jump to the support of the common sense. I mean, she was too good of a philosopher to do that. But she would really take both sides very seriously. And I think that's at least if you're doing normative ethics and the parts of metaethics that sort of may impinge on that, I think that provides a very good model. for people.
Yeah, perhaps we could move on to the next of our questions, and then because there is a sense in which her sticking to common sense helped her respond to moral subjectivism, which was a dominant attitude at the time in philosophy, and I think that it's also the dominant attitude among first-year undergraduates in philosophy at LSE, which is, I may be oversimplifying, but here's a precise way of putting it, which is that moral judgments just express your evaluative attitudes and intentions, and that knowledge about the facts of the case, for example, that my children are starving and they won't be fed unless I feed them, those are the facts, right? That doesn't compel any moral judgment whatsoever. What makes it a moral judgment, if you think you ought to now feed your starving children because you can, and stop watching TV, for example, or reading your philosophy book, that moral judgment only happens when you have a certain attitude, an evaluative attitude of disapproval of my continuing to read the latest article on ethics or watch TV, and approval of the act of taking care of one's kids. But these are not compelled in any way by the facts, these judgments. So there's a strong fact-value distinction. And basically, I mean, Sarah, you said, we spoke a bit before, that Philippa took kind of attacked this view from the perspective of a mix of common sense and appeal to the vices and virtues. Is that right?
Yes, well, I think her sort of earliest kind of effort against this subjectivism was to argue, or just bring to people's attention, really, that judgments about, I mean, it may be judgments, moral judgments using very abstract terms like right and wrong, okay, or good and bad for that matter. Maybe this theory of the fact-value gulf or divide might seem, as it were, to work in the context of those abstract judgments. But she focused, and here she was, I think, very much encouraged, perhaps inspired by Elizabeth Anscombe's work. Obviously, Anscombe got her, or suggested reading Aristotle and reading Aquinas, two the great heroes of both of them. So, anyway, to come to the point, Philippa pointed out that making the case for judging somebody to be a coward or brave or dishonest or fair-minded or trustworthy or, a traitor or something like that. These are all moral terms, but they're full of descriptive meaning, as the jargon is, okay? And it seemed to her reasonable to think that these are actually, in real life, outside the academy, we actually treat these as factual judgments, true or false. We base them on factual evidence, and so on. So this was a kind of way in, a very important way in, to criticising on a sound theoretical basis, not just because one doesn't like it, that fact-value distinction.
And can I ask you about that a bit?
Yes, please.
Because, so how does this work precisely? The idea is that a virtue like courage is an inextricable mix of ascribing to someone the virtue of courage. So I say, Jane is courageous.
Yes.
I can't separate out neatly the fact and value claims that I'm making, and they somehow go together. But
right. That was her claim. That, in other words, contrary to what Alex was saying a few minutes ago, we can't just decide. It may seem plausible to say that we can decide whether to say that something is right or wrong, or good or bad, somehow as we choose, and that somebody else, faced by exactly the same facts, might come to the opposite good, bad, right, wrong judgment. The answer to that she started to develop back then was maybe leave aside those abstract judgments. Let's look at more sort of, as they came to be called, thick moral terms like courageous, dishonest, unreliable, those kinds of terms. And she said, it just isn't plausible here to say that you and another person could look at exactly the same facts, and one of them come to the conclusion that the person is dishonest, and the other person come to the conclusion that that he or she is honest. I mean, the person under consideration. So that, in other words, if we move away from those abstract terms to these so-called thicker terms, then the great classic distinction seems to begin to crumble.
But can't we both agree that someone is honest and still hold a different judgment on the fact? So I say, yes, Jane is a very honest person, and I think that honesty is for suckers. So we're agreeing on the same facts, but we can attach different values to it. So I don't yet understand how speaking in terms of virtues helps us get past the fact-value distinction.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that Philippa, as it were, was facing this kind of objection, this kind of criticism, a valid criticism, in many ways throughout her philosophical career. So, for example, in Plato's dialogue Republic, one of the characters other than Socrates takes very much this line, and there's other places in ancient philosophy where we find this. So somebody says, okay, this person is just and righteous and all the rest of it, but A, so what? And B, I have very good reason, and perhaps really all of us, except that we've been brainwashed, have very good reason not to be like that.
Exactly.
Okay. What does the so-called virtue ethicist, right, which this name wasn't used at that time, but it's what sort of came to be used for this Philippa's kind of one of her approach. What does the virtue ethicist say in reply to that? And it's not just a case of perhaps rather crude opponents of Socrates, but one philosopher whom Philippa took extremely seriously was Nietzsche, because, of course, in a much more sophisticated way, and one which, as it were, appeals to a whole lot of our modern sensibilities, he was making the case for, okay, so let's agree that is morality, but I don't like it very much, and a really enlightened person, a thoughtful person, the person who's not been browbeaten or brainwashed, is going to join me in not liking it very much, right? So she realized that she had to deal intellectually with, as it were, a whole new level, not just these Oxford philosophers who've gone on about fact value, but to people who made the comeback that you just gave.
Yes, I mean, there's an element, well, let me put it sharply and see what you think about this. There's an element of conservatism if one says, look, this is the way we talk about morality. You can't call someone a murderer without thinking it's a bad thing. So the fact and value mix together there. Or you can't call someone a coward without thinking it's bad. So the facts determine that someone is a coward in these circumstances and that you must think it's a bad thing. Our moral norms about what we regard as a virtue or vice change over time, and to merely, for example, Peter Singer might think, and has argued, that certain forms of caring attitude towards infants, newborns, might be regarded as virtuous,
right,
but are entirely inappropriate. Or in other times, people thought that homosexuality was an abomination and a vice, and we, in part because of moral theory, like Bentham was one of the first to argue that in favor of legalizing homosexuality. So the thought is that there's a conservatism, perhaps, at the heart of appealing to common sense morality and the common way we use certain vice and virtue terms, which a more theoretical stance can overcome.
Yes, and if I was trying to argue on behalf of Philippa Foot, I'm not entirely sure what I would say at this point, because I mean what you've just said is obviously something one has to take very seriously. There would never be cultural, let's just call it progress in values, although obviously things can go the other way as well, if there were not, as it were, some slippage as between facts and how we estimate those facts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't see how she could possibly have denied that. So that maybe our views over the centuries or something might change as to, what really does count as a brave person and what doesn't. I mean, Aristotle's courageous person is entirely depicted on the battlefield. It's as if, I'm not saying that he really believed this, but I mean, it's as if courage had no role in any other area of life. Yeah, the idea of a female courageous person almost becomes, given the social circumstances, kind of contradiction in terms,
right.
And so on and so on. I mean, I wonder whether we should have, since I brought in Nietzsche, whether we should move the discussion just a little tiny bit. And so away from this question of our standards or our criteria for calling someone or regarding someone as brave, as having integrity or whatever virtue word you want, these standards might shift and change, right? Maybe we should move a little bit to the question about the great big question about why should I be moral?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is really, even if, let's just home in on a society or on the whole world, if you like, at a given point in time. Okay, so let's suppose that almost everybody in the world has the same moral standards. Would that it was so? Or maybe we should be glad that it's not so. Anyway, whatever. So just about everybody agrees, this is just behaviour, this is unjust, and all the rest of it. And that's morality. And then comes along this revolutionary and daring thinker and says, well, why should I care about being moral? And of course, the edge to that question, as I'm sure everybody knows, is that morality, which Plato's word is justice, and the dilemma comes up in the context of his dialogue Republic, but morality or justice does sometimes require us, as it seems, to go against our own interest in the interests of others, right? And that seems to be just the way it is with justice. And so there's a real question. Why should I do that? And if I just say, oh, well, I would feel guilty if I don't or something, then the eagle-eyed, brave questioner like Nietzsche, or like Plato's character, will say, well, if you feel guilty, it's only because you haven't really thought this through and you go with the herd, right? So a really interesting and, actually quite dramatic, but nonetheless very philosophical dialogue opens up here. And she was very, very interested in that. Whether you think she had an adequate answer to why be moral, Alex, I'm going to leave you to say about that.
So it's interesting that this is the oldest, one of the oldest questions in ethics, right? That starts, as Sarah was saying, the Republic starts about this question: why should I do what's claimed to be right when it goes against my interests? And Foot grappled with this during her life, and I think it's fair enough to say that there are two versions of her attempts to answer. The first was simply to say that an amoralist, so a person who doesn't even recognize the force of moral reasons at all, that there's nothing wrong with this person, in the sense of there's nothing. The person may be, callous, cruel, selfish, etc. So we can say that he or she has various vices. But we cannot claim that the person is irrational. There's nothing in reason that compels us, or so she said at the time, to take morality seriously. So we can claim that the person is defective in many ways. They're nasty, cruel, unpleasant, but they're not irrational. And her analogy at the time, the paper was called Morality is a System of Hypothetical Imperatives, right? Mm-hmm. Was with the rules of etiquette. So etiquette tells you, I think her example was, one must not eat peas with a spoon. Is that it?
Something
yes.
like that.
So that's a categorical imperative. Like one must not eat peas with a spoon. That applies to you whether you want to be engaged in this game of etiquette or not. Right? You're being rude if you eat your peas with a spoon, or at least in the world in which she was, in which she grew up. However, she said, you might not care one whit for etiquette, and no amount of banging on about how important these rules are will make you change your mind if you don't care about the ends of etiquette. And she drew an analogy there with morality, saying the same goes for morality. Just as you can call someone rude or uncouth who eats his peas with a spoon, you could say direct certain derogatory claims towards someone who's immoral, but they're not being irrational. However, later she changed her view on this, and she claimed that it's part of being rational to recognize the force of moral reasons. So that part of the trouble, she said, with trying to find what reason do I have to be moral, is that the whole question is a mistake on her later view. We're already confused. The earlier picture she had of rationality was something close to what Hume proposed. So Hume famously said, it's not irrational of me to prefer the destruction of the entire world over the scratching of my finger.
My little
finger, not just any finger, my little finger. And what he meant with that is, look, we don't dispute about, or we can dispute about ends, but it's not irrational for you to prefer any kind of thing as a final end. All that's irrational is not taking the right means to your given ends. That's where you might be irrational. So means-end rationality, no rationality or irrationality in your particular aims. Later, Foot said something, she might have said the following to Hume, what would one say to someone who said, I prefer the destruction of the entire world to the scratching of my little finger? One would say he's insane, right? You're crazy. And that's a way of saying you're irrational. Basically saying that to reason also belongs the choice of our ends, not merely the means to certain ends, but also the choice of the right ends. Now, trained as an economist, I was much on Hume's side here, so I liked her previous view, and I just wanted to put up a bit of a dialogue that I had with her on this. So I must say that when I did the interview with her, it was a long time ago, I was still a student, and I arrived very well dressed, but also very nervous and a bit early. So before I rung her bell, I stood just outside her garden smoking some cigarettes to kind of calm my nerves. And she must have seen me from her window, because when I started questioning her about this idea of rational criticism of ends, she said, enough with your questions, I'm going to ask you some questions. And she said, what would you say about a young person who doesn't care about the chance of getting lung cancer due to smoking in 20 years' time? Do you call this contrary to practical rationality? And I said, trying to stick, with my Humean guns, I said, it depends on what this person's attitudes are, right? If he doesn't care about his health, then he's not doing anything irrational. She says, what if this young person cares about being well dressed? At 40, she was pointing to my new suit, but not about his health at 40. And then I paused, and I did the thing which she tells you to do, and Wittgenstein told you to do, just come out with the troubling and odd thought, even though you're going to make trouble for yourself. I said, although he's being consistent, I might want to say that he's not recognizing something that he should recognize. And then she realized she had the fish on the hook when she said, and where do you get that should from, right? Because the should, she claimed, is a rational should. I ought to here not endanger my health for a trivial pleasure, and it's being irrational of me not to care enough about my health relative to the trivial pleasure I was seeking. So that was her attempted answer, to simply say, dismiss the question as a non-question, almost, and insist that caring, at least to some extent, about other people's well-being, about being honest, about caring for one's children, about not being a coward, etc., is just part of what a rational person cares about. To me, I struggled mightily in the rest of the interview, but I didn't manage to get her into any difficulty, I'm afraid. It just sounds like insisting that you ought to take certain things as your ends, and if you don't, you're irrational, you're rationally defective. And I'm still quite uncomfortable with that, but I don't know what you make of this solution.
Well, of course, she spent a lot of time as in the sort of second part of her life as a philosopher, working on this notion of, well, tying in the human virtues that we've talked about a bit to the idea that there are universal and very basic human needs, right? And were we not, so it's not just a matter of being a rational being as such, which is a kind of Kantian way of looking at it, but being a human rational being. Alistair MacIntyre, in one of his books, has this wonderful title of Dependent Rational Animals. So we're rational animals which are vulnerable, which need security, which have to be constantly fed and maintained. We belong to families and communities in which some people are stronger or healthier and others are weaker and so on and so forth. Those weak ones also have to be taken care of. They can't do it themselves, etc., etc. And this is the kind of being that we are. So she built quite a lot of her answer to the amoralist who just says, well, why can't my ends be just anything that I like? By simply pointing to these facts of human nature. Okay. Now, of course, this doesn't really, and I think Philippa was always aware of this, it doesn't really get over that huge hurdle about justice. Because, maybe everybody cares about their own and their own loved ones' security and health and flourishing and all the rest of it. That is, but we also know that even if selfishness is not the only human motive, we do know that selfishness is one very powerful human motive, and human beings throughout the generations, I mean, this is never going to change, have had to struggle sometimes to do the right thing, even though it's against their own interest, and painful, right? Not just deleterious, but painful. And so pointing to these great needs of human life doesn't, I think, quite get us where we want to. However, she was very emphatic about the fact, and I think that this is, in my view, it's correct, that we are not artificially social animals. Society is not just an artificial construct, although, of course, how you run society might be, as it were, conventional or largely conventional. But that we are social is a basic natural fact about us, just as much as the fact that we walk on two legs or that we have language. And, of course, having language and being social creatures is kind of bound up with each other. So that I think, was her first kind of step, or that was where she tried to put her foot in the door of this problem about justice. You can't have society, even small societies, maybe especially small societies, unless you have enough people being just. And individuals need society, they need love, they need support. They need even sometimes to be able to give those things like love and support, not just to receive them. So that you need enough people, well, respecting justice for that particular human, collective human need to be able to be fulfilled.
Yes, so
Does that answer your problem?
Not fully, but you know what? Rather than continue this point further, perhaps we can just cover her last bit on dilemmas, and then we can have more of a.
Oh yes, we mustn't forget the trolley problem.
Yes. Yeah. So this one, although it occupied only a very small part of Philippa's work, she wrote on many moral dilemmas, but here's one which was became particularly famous, and she started out with the following puzzle, which is, why is it, take a case, someone walks into a surgery who's perfectly healthy, and the doctor eyes him up and thinks, aha, 2 healthy kidneys, a liver, a heart, and some lungs, that's just what I need in the room next door to save 5 separate people, and he happens to have the right blood type as well. So the man comes in with stomach pain. He says, oh, this is really not looking so good. Take this. He gives him an instant poison. He dies on the spot and uses the organs to save 5 others. The thought there is, this is that transplant case, as I'll call it, and as Foot said, we would think this is outrageous, even though there are 5 lives saved at the cost of 1. She thought, there's a puzzle here, not so much about that judgment, but about how that judgment compares to the following case, which she called the trolley case. If you click it, you get it. Now, there's an important way in which she described this case, which is different from later ways in which it showed up. So I'll go with the old school original version, which is you're the driver of a trolley, which is headed not like this arrow, but straight towards 5 people who will be crushed on the track. And it's important, perhaps, that
the brakes have failed.
The brakes have failed, right? So you can't brake. All you can do is direct it onto a different side track where there's 1, and kill 1 instead. She said, now here it seems perfectly permissible to kill 1 in order to save the lives of the 5. So what can explain the difference between the transplant case and this trolley case? Now, she considers there a Catholic doctrine, which is known as the doctrine of double effect, which says, roughly, you can't intend harm to 1 in order to do greater good, but you can cause harm as an unintended side effect of your action, which leads to the greater good on balance. So that principle could explain this difference. Right? The transplant case, you're intending harm to the 1. You're chopping him up, using him as a means in order to save the 5. Whereas in this case, the harm to the 1 is entirely an unintended side effect. As she says, suppose that in the transplant case, the man figures out what you're trying to do and tries to make off, right, escape before you administer the lethal dose, right? You'll trap him and make sure he swallows the poison pill. Whereas in this case, suppose by fortune you miss the man, he said the driver of the trolley will not get out and use a wrench and brain him in order to make sure that he's really and truly dead. So there's a strong difference in the intention in both cases. Even though it works in this case, she rejects the principle for reasons we could go into, but her main solution is, she says, you should go for something different in this case. Rather than this rather strange thing of intention, why should it matter whether I intend someone's death or not, what part he or she is of my plans, she says, we can explain it in the difference between negative and positive rights. So you have a negative right not to be harmed, you have a positive right to be helped. And negative rights are stronger, she says, more forceful than positive rights. So in the transplant case, 5 people have a positive right to be saved. 1 person has a right not to be harmed. You ought not to harm the person for the sake of saving the 5. And here it's very important in the trolley case, the contrasting case, that you're the driver, and she claims you would either harm the 5, kill the 5, you would kill the 5, even though there's nothing you could do about it. She thinks as the driver you would be violating their rights by killing them, or you could violate the rights against being harmed of 1. So this is a rights, don't violate the negative rights of 1, or don't violate the negative rights of 5. Numbers matter in this case, but it's negative rights versus negative rights. Whereas the transplant case is 1 person's negative right against 5 people's positive rights. She claims the negative right trumps the positive rights. Now, it's interesting that the trolley case took off from here, and I won't go on the many different versions of looping bridges, etc., various changes, but one very small change already shows us a problem with her proposed solution, which was to appeal to negative and positive rights. Because the way it's done now in the literature, thanks to another great woman, philosopher, Judith Jarvis Thomson, she did the following very small change, which makes all the difference to this argument. So instead of you being the driver of the trolley, you are a bystander at a spur, and you can flip the switch. If you don't flip the switch, you see that this trolley will go on and crush 5. If you do, you can redirect it and it will kill 1. Now that is a case, most plausibly construed, as if you let it go, you're failing to save the 5, you're not acting on their positive rights, you're not protecting their positive rights to be saved, or if you redirect it on the sidetrack, you are killing the 1, you're violating his right against being harmed. Nonetheless, many people think, and in various studies, we won't do the show of hands here, that it's perfectly permissible to redirect it. So I think the subsequent discussion has showed that it's Foot's first proposed solution is at the very least problematic, right? A very small change in the case she proposed shows that her principle can't be doing all the work, the difference between negative and positive rights. And what's interesting, I don't know if this inspired her at the time, but when she was in London during the war, some of you may know this case, the Germans were launching V1 and V2 bombs at central London, and British intelligence redirected them by giving them false information towards less populated areas on the outskirts of London, and by some estimates saved many thousands of lives as a consequence. So there's a bit of a distraction here. What are these people doing on the track anyway, etc.? I mean, maybe they're all signed up to some policy, let's minimize the number of workers who are being killed, etc. Now imagine that this is a V1 rocket. This is the British government's policy of redirecting it towards less populated areas. This is it of letting the Germans hit those that they intended to hit to begin with. Right? It's interesting, though, there's no trace of it in her articles, but one wonders whether it was part of the thinking that went to generating interest in the trolley problem.
I'd be very surprised if it was common knowledge at the time, though, wouldn't you?
That's true, though. It was written about somewhat later.
Uh-huh.
I mean, in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, but during the war,
that's true.
Probably
That's true.
They would have done anything rather than let it hurt.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Though perhaps when she was writing the articles in the 60s, 70s, it was
By then it was known.
common knowledge.
Yes.
And a lot of people at Oxford worked in the secret services.
Absolutely.
No, it's true. Many philosophers in the world. Anyway, so it may just be pure accident that she herself was a beneficiary of the redirection because she lived in central London, or that it was in the air at the time. But in essence, she launched a problem here, I think. But I would say, in my view, the initial solution was not entirely successful.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on this?
I sort of tremble when people start to talk about the trolley problem because it has become so complicated and there are so many sort of layers of different distinctions. I mean, it's inspired, whether or not Philippa's original solution works, I think Alex is right that it doesn't. Or at least as soon as you try to generalize it, you run into trouble. But it's certainly been absolutely seminal of an incredible amount of very, very acute and sometimes also, really quite deep thinking. But interestingly, when she first brought in this example, it was actually almost incidental to her main question, and you said it very clearly, that is, what is the difference between deciding, in the original trolley case, well, you're the driver, what's the difference between deciding to divert it to 1 and letting it go on to 5? Why is it that we think that it's not only permissible, but many of us would think that we ought to divert it to kill just the 1? Why do we not reach the same verdict in the case of the 1 versus 5, where it's the organs transplant? So, in a way, the trolley problem was, as it were, incidental to trying to bring out what was special about this other case, which does have to do with the invasion of people's rights. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting that, and then I think let's open it up for discussion, that in rereading her articles in the collection Moral Dilemmas, as a philosopher, when you do, a lot of these are questions of bioethics. If I saw someone reading Peter Singer's book, over there somewhere, The Life You Can Save or something. If one reads Peter Singer, it always ends with a punchline, this is what we ought to do. Right? And it's often a controversial claim that ends it grounded in moral theory. When one reads Philippa Foot's material, it's always about what is it that's bothering us about this case? Can we get clear on what's bothering us? And are there principles, like she claimed the doctrine of double effect, that are leading us astray? So there's a kind of, the first, I mean, it's a paper on abortion. It's called Abortion and the Doctrine of Double Effect. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, now we're going to get to the end, and she's going to tell me whether she thinks abortion is justified or not. None of that. She figures she's cleared away some of the dead wood, so now we know, now we see the problem clearly, and let's talk about that, and then you get to talk about it, right? She seems to see her job as a philosopher a lot as making us see clearly what's at stake rather than telling us this is what you ought to do.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's right. Helping people to think more clearly rather than producing some justified verdict, I think.
Isn't that a bit small for philosophy?
Helping people to think more clearly.
Well, I mean, in the end, but the question still needs to be resolved.
I suspect that Philippa Foot thought, although I don't know for sure, that there is no single clear-cut answer to that particular question. I mean, I suspect that she thought that abortion is legitimate in some cases and not, or at least, you know, one could understand someone thinking not in others, and maybe there are also going to be cases in between. So that unless you know more about the situation, you're not going to be able to... There is no single answer. Yeah. I think that's probably what she would have thought.
Okay, thanks. Shall we?
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have about half an hour for discussion, so, yeah.
Oh, thanks, that was fascinating. 2 points. One, when we were talking about the trolley case, I was thinking about the abortion business, about the healthy babies and the Downs babies. And if you put the 5 Downs babies there, you divert to say 5 Downs, or the other way around, you have 1 healthy, 1 versus 5. I didn't want to talk about that a bit more. But the other one I wanted to raise is this is about the force of moral reason. Now, to me, that's a zoom. Is there reason in morality? Back to the peas and the spoon. And I just wanted to flag that up and see what you, if you have anything to comment on that.
Do you want to start off, Sarah?
Well, I think she came to the view. I mean, it was a puzzle about when it started. Why are the so-called imperatives of morality? Why are they not like the equally categorical, in the logical sense, imperatives of etiquette, right? And we can just nobody, you know, thinks that there's something seriously wrong with us if we just shrug off etiquette and say, I just don't want to buy into any of that stuff. Why is it not like that with morality? Right, and when she first posed this question with the comparison with etiquette, she didn't really have an answer. And then later, I mean decades later, she sort of worked towards an answer, which was this rather slightly diffuse thing that I was trying to say about basic human needs. I mean, no basic human need is served by eating peas with a fork rather than a spoon. Whereas, you know, what I said before sort of clicks in, yeah. But whether that would satisfy you, only you can decide. Yeah.
If I might add, so I take it that her view was that, look, given the types of beings that we are and the needs that we have to recognize certain things as important to lead minimally decent human lives together. And it's the recognition of those things as important, which is part of practical reason about deciding what to do. So you are indeed being irrational if you, on her view, or at least you're defective in your reasoning, if you don't recognize the pain of your children as a reason for alleviating that pain. I take it that that's something like her answer, just in the way that she drew parallels with other animals. So suppose that a wolf isn't isn't fierce in defending its territory, right? Well, it couldn't lead the life, a good wolf's life, so to speak, if it didn't have certain characteristics like that. And a wolf would be defective if it lacked in that respect. If every time it saw a squirrel, it decided that bared its teeth, it turned and ran. Right? So similarly, I think her argument was human beings have to recognize certain things as giving them reasons for action, like the suffering of another that you can easily alleviate, the fact that you promised someone, etc., for us to be able to lead, together, human lives that meet our most basic human needs. Right? That was the role I think that she thought reason played, or the link that morality had with reason. Is that?
I think that's right, and I think that she, maybe especially in some of the later material, put a lot of weight on things like the sense of solidarity with other people, which makes us feel bad if we're tempted to do free riding and stuff like that. I mean, okay, I can get away with it. It's not really going to, at least if just me, I do it, damage the community. But nonetheless, we feel that's somewhat disgraceful, or we often do. And I think that her approach to this, which rather ties in with something that we were both saying earlier, is that instead of thinking that this sense of solidarity, which perhaps often leads us in the end to do the right thing, or to take our share of the burdens, that sense of solidarity, instead of being something that philosophers should find really basically puzzling because it just doesn't seem to be rational, instead we should do a complete flip-flop in our way of looking at it and see this as itself a rational way to be, that is, have that sense of solidarity with our fellow human beings, a rational way to be, given that we're the kind of creatures who need to live in communities. Do you think? Yeah.
Yes, although I'm
you
not
may
persuaded by
you
the
may
view,
not
but
be
I think
persuaded. No.
That's as good as it gets.
I mean, from your encounters with her, was she the sort of person who initially, at the earlier times, have eaten her peas with a spoon and then moved on to it with a fork, or the other way round?
I'm sure she always ate her peas with a fork. But I also think she would have thought. I mean, she had a strong sense of the ridiculous. I think she would have thought, it is fairly ridiculous that we make a thing about that. Yeah.
Okay, let's take another question. Yes,
Well, Philippa Foot from a Catholic background, but where would you place her on the political spectrum?
You might know
Well,
that
as far as I know, she was not from a Catholic background. I believe she was an atheist throughout her adult life. And I just read or reread something which said she was always a Labour supporter. So she was she was kind of socialist without, nothing about Marxism, but so that was her. That was where she was.
What was her maiden name?
Bosanquet.
But she wasn't related to the Bosanquets. Bernard Bosanquet.
I've never heard of there being any other philosophers in the family, but who knows? Maybe it has some hidden connection. But she was the granddaughter of a president of the United States, so some people may think that's more important.
Which one?
Yeah.
Grover Cleveland.
Yes, her mother was. He was her maternal grandfather. Her mother was the first baby born in the White House. So, that's where they learnt not to eat peas with the spoon.
In America? No.
No, I know, in America it's all funny, yes.
yes.
Yeah, you...
You were just talking just then about the reasons for action being reasons that lead to a successful and flourishing society. Does that not necessarily perhaps push you into quite a positivist moral theory? In particular, it might lead you to conclude that what you should do is just the socially optimal thing to do, push you into more consequentialist position.
It's good. You mean positivist in the sense of Kant? You mean positivist in the sense of Auguste Comte, the utilitarian?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But
So
I think she was quite
it is interesting. The thought is, though, that we're talking about dispositions, and rather than particular actions, right? And it's not some kind of there's many ways in which it's different from utilitarianism. Sorry, let me get two things. First is, as I understand her view, it's natural for human beings, given the types of beings that we are and the needs that we have, to come to care about certain things, and it's a defect if they don't, right? Which is a certain degree of solidarity, a certain degree of caring about your own health, about others, about rules, following certain rules that we make, right? Now, those rules and the behavior to which these impulses give rise, the virtues and vices, right, the virtues have to tend towards the human good. They have to tend towards meeting certain basic human needs. And so do the rules. However, there's no assumption that there's then some construct as the total good, like utilitarianism requires, right? But your well-being, your neighbor's well-being, and we sum it all up, and that's what we ought to maximize, right? So there's two ways in which it's different from utilitarianism. The first is that it's not about individual actions, but rather about character dispositions, including the disposition to adhere to certain rules, like promise-keeping, property, etc. And the second difference from ordinary act utilitarianism is that there's no notion of the total good. Of course, that means that certain things are left rather vague, right? It's very rare in life that a particular set of virtues, right, that we have in our society will not involve trade-offs. Right? The way we've organized things now, we think that certain rights, including property rights, stand in the way. Respect for these should stand in the way of doing a lot of good. Right? So benevolence is constrained by justice. We can imagine that the world might be, in certain respects, a better place if we placed less weight in certain trade-off situations on justice and more on benevolence. So Foot isn't committed to any precise formula in these cases, right? But I think she would be very resistant to the notion of there being anything morally significant, except as a kind of theoretical construct, the total well-being that we ought to have, that virtues promote and vices detract from.
Should we take the next question, or do you want to add something?
No, that's fine. I'm happy.
Okay, so the point about these universal and basic human needs seems to be, it seems to bring us to say, if we want to flourish and survive and continue to survive, then there will be certain things we should do about recognizing solidarity and all of that. But I wonder what Philippa Foot would say to the question, why should we want to survive in the first place? I don't know, it's coupled by this. So.
Well, I think that's a very good question, and actually people don't always realise this, but this features in G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica. You probably know that. He points out that a great many of our, as it were, what we think of as morally necessary things, actually is based on a kind of, not exactly a hypothetical, but it's conditioned on the fact that we take it for granted that it's good that life should go on. If not just for ourselves or for every single person, but at any rate for the species, for our country, for our family, and so forth. I'm not sure that, I have to say I haven't really thought nearly enough about this, whatever enough would be. But I think it makes sense to ask, do we need to have a reason for living? I mean, if we do, most of us want to live, and that's very important to us, doesn't that situation in itself constitute a ground for us to respect each other's safety and help each other with healthcare and stuff like that? Do we have to have, as it were, a theoretical justification to... Now, what I've just said may work, but it might still be, but it is a curious fact, or maybe not so curious, but I mean, it is a fact that we can want to understand better, or want to, is there a justification for our continuing to live? And I think as soon as one asks that question, one gets into very deep water. I mean, one of the deep waters that one gets into is that, as is only too easy or reasonable these days to worry about the world or our planet having too many people, right? And one can sometimes find oneself wondering, usually leaving oneself out of the argument, is it somehow better for the universe or for the human race that every single person who's now born has a good chance, should have, not that everybody does yet, but a good chance of surviving and living to be 90 and having not only children, grandchildren, but great-great-grandchildren.
I took it, though, that your question might be even tougher for someone with Foot's views, as we've been trying to put it here. Of course, it would be better if she were here to defend herself. But as I understood what you were asking, it's really like, leave aside currently existing people, right? It's on her, analogy with other animals, which she draws for the human virtues and vices, it's natural for animals to want to propagate, or at least they probably don't give much thought to the fact that there will be offspring as a consequence, but to have the desires that lead to procreation, etc. And one might say those are the way animals should be. That's a normal species functioning. Now apply that to human beings. It seems as if she would be committed to the view that it's virtuous for us to want to keep on, to want to have children and to propagate the species, whereas it seems, rather than it's straightforwardly virtuous, something that we should be able to morally debate. So doesn't that show a difficulty with this idea? The title of her last book was Natural Goodness, of trying to relate what's virtuous to what it is part of good species functioning.
Well, I think when you think of this concept, natural goodness, in the case of human beings, and maybe not any of the other animals that we're familiar with, nature, as we know from our experience, means much more than just biological nature. Okay, so I think that she could get quite a long way towards answering your question just on that basis. I mean, arguably, it's unnatural for human beings to be packed together into
in a lecture hall in the dark. Yes.
Where they, each family has just a few a tiny room to live in, and so on. So we can't exercise properly, we can't see nature, we can't breathe fresh air, and all of these things. Okay, and arguably that is clearly contrary to human nature as, for example, being unable to propagate is contrary to general biological human nature. Then the question arises, as so often it's come up several times already in this discussion, we might have, in a practical situation, we might have competing. So we might want to have a city which is cleaner, more spacious, and so on and so forth, but the only way we can do it is by getting rid of a lot of people. Is that acceptable? Or somehow moving so that...
A difficult question.
Yeah, probably. Trying to curb the birth rate so that in the next generation it might be seriously smaller or whatever, I mean, the practical questions ramify because we one value against another. And then, each family wants to have one or more children, or at least we think they have the right to, and so on and so on and so on. Yep.
I think it's fair to say at this point that something applies, which I said before, which is Foot didn't see it as part of her project to answer a series of problematic questions, but rather, and you may regard this as a good or bad thing about her work, but rather to help identify the right way to think about moral questions, like the objectivity of morals or the problem of abortion, etc. Rather than, so it's perhaps not surprising that we're struggling to think of what she would say in response to your question.
So there's, well, you mentioned there's obviously a fair amount of Aristotelian influence here, and so what I find interesting about Aristotelian ethics is that there's a sort of holism to it, right? There's this kind of notion of the good life, and the good life includes acting ethically towards others, but also certain virtues of prudence and certain kind of connection in there. And that obviously has connections with this idea of kind of universal human beings. So should we wonder how universal that is, right? What counts as a good life for you depends on what kind of person you are. And so what if you're a psychopath? So that's a strange question, right? So I mean, if you just that just isn't part of your psychology, the kind of altruistically directed feeling. And in fact, this goes directly back to Aristotle. Also, I mean, he lived in a slave-owning society. They all had, X number of slaves who did all the hard work, so they could lead good lives, right? I mean, I think Aristotle probably had a good life. Well, I'm not sure about the biography exactly, but I'm sure many people in that situation had good lives. I mean, it was bought at the cost of not so great lives for other people. But within the kind of being, or especially the kind of socially constituted being that Aristotle was, that was a good life.
Yes, I think that's correct. But he probably had considers himself to have a good life, and probably we might want to say that, yes, he did. But I mean, you've raised two different issues. One of them is, what about if one is a psychopath? You know, is it possible to have a good life? Is a psychopath's good life something we should, as it were, try to make happen for the psychopath? So on and so forth. So that's one question, to which I don't actually have a ready answer. And then a different question, perhaps in a way more serious question, because more people are involved, is equality, or rather gross inequality, such as occurs in a slave-owning society. And I mean, it would be nice to be able to say nobody can really have a good life, while some people in the society are having a really terrible life, and the happy people are actually, the goodness of their good life depends on the trampled down status of those other people. It would be nice to be able to say that, but I don't think that, realistically one can. I think I'm not saying, of course, that inequality, gross inequality and injustice are necessary conditions for people to have good lives. But I just want to say that I do believe that some people who've been lucky enough to be, as it were, at the top of the tree in a social situation like that probably did have good lives. Yeah. And then, of course, the question of whether, it's worth, if the goodness of their good lives, as it were, counterbalances or makes up for the misery that perhaps helped to support it. Maybe that's your question, but again,
I think the notion of counterbalancing is almost kind of foreign to the whole.
I think that's right.
Just so long as you exhibit the virtues, right, that is good life. I mean, it's almost kind of besides the point what the preconditions for that or the external conditions. So I think that's the worry.
I mean, well, what one, again, I don't, it's not my view, but what one might say in reply here is that there's definitely something lacking in the life of someone who's insensitive to the fate of the slaves that support them, right? And historically, I think cases of great injustice, at least those that I'm familiar with through reading about, involve a kind of forcible separating oneself from blocking out the situation of others. Doing a kind of violence to the natural flow of solidarity or sympathy. And now they're countervailing human motives like pride and wanting to be in a better position. But I think that if within virtue ethics one would try to account for why couldn't be fully displayed in a slave-owning society, I think one would have to talk about the distorting effects of such a society, or one that, murdered Jews, or various other atrocities, right? That there's a kind of lack of flourishing, at least certain respects, a kind of warping of natural human tendencies, so that even if life would go well in other respects, you wouldn't be fully flourishing as a human being because you'd have to have this like unnatural cutting off from certain human feelings.
Well, let's take another question because there were quite a few other questions. You had your hand up earlier. Do you still have a question? Yeah.
Oh, well, several times I've had things to say. Just as the last one, I would agree with you. In the Pompeii exhibition, it was quite clear that there was a commerce of feeling and sympathy throughout, because there was a neighbourhood, and slaves were in fact very often enabled to become citizens of Rome, and the slaves were part of a household, or where the feelings wouldn't have been very, very different to ordinary kind of helpers in our society, people who are less foreigners coming in, as it were, and helping. So it's not quite slaves being whipped all the time, but sympathy, and sometimes they actually inherited. But that was the last thing I thought of, because you just mentioned it. The other things I won't go back to.
Okay, well, let's just maybe then take that as a comment, and then you had a question.
I'm quite interested in what you said about how she spent a lot of time kind of finding out what the problem was and not necessarily solving it. I come from I'm an economist, and I am continually being accused of never solving a problem and just reframing it. I also noted that you said that she worked as an economist. I'd like to know to what extent did economics come into her ideas in her work?
Well, I'll say something briefly. I don't know very much about this, except that she told me she studied PPE at Oxford, but that because of her background, she thought economics was very interesting, but she hadn't had much math training. So she found that, though she liked the theoretical aspect of economics, she found she was better at doing philosophy. And I think she just worked as an economist because that was the war work that she was given. I don't think that later, reading on her work later on, doesn't show much influence from the economics training that she had.
So early thoughts about morality is not necessarily rational. Wasn't informed from any sort of normative.
That's an interesting question. It may well have been. I mean, she would at least have been educated into the standard model of preferences and utility maximization as a way of modeling, for example, rational consumers. So perhaps it had some echoes in her thought, but that would just be speculating. Yeah.
Right, I think we have time for just one last brief question. Yes.
Just going back to yourself and Dean's point, you're saying that you're not fully flourishing if you're having a society in which some people are slaves and you're kind of working off that. Your earlier point about why did you care? Well, we care because we want to have a society that exists. We need a society. So why do I care that I'm not flourishing?
Why do you care that you're not flourishing?
Because I live in a society that fulfills my need to have a society.
Right.
So I've ticked that box.
Yes. You have a lot of goods because other people are working for you. Yes, a lot of spare time to do philosophy. Yes.
So why do I care I'm not flourishing?
Yes. I'm going to pass this one to our Aristotelian expert.
Well, I said something different. I'm not particularly trying to speak on behalf of Philippa Foot. I think more realistically that even in a situation of gross inequality and exploitation, it may well be that some people do have good lives. And it may well be that they have those good lives at least partly, if not completely, at the expense of the oppressed people. So to say to them, well, you're not really flourishing because you're living in the midst of all this horrible stuff. If they say, well, I'm fine with my life, so your question is, what do we say to them then? Well, I would, as it were, on a more empirical basis, perhaps, just say, well, okay, you have a good life, but has it ever occurred to you that maybe we can spread the goods a little bit more widely, maybe we can have more freedom, more respect for rights, and so on and so forth? And then, of course, the way that conversation continues is just going to depend on you, not me. So, yeah. So I wouldn't say, you live well. Actually, this is quite a good starting point for this conversation. You live well, but now what about those other people? And then, depending on the person's personality, they might think, well, what do they have to do with me? Or they may think, wow, their eyes may be opened a little bit, and so on.
Right, okay. I'm sure we could continue discussing for a long time, but unfortunately we have to end here. So please join me in thanking Alex and Sarah, and thank you very much.